Mississippi is known for being one of the most conservative states in the entire country, and yet in Tuesday's election, we're expecting a much closer contest than what we typically see in elections in the state. Incumbent Republican Governor Tate Reeves is pretty unpopular, and he's going up against strong Democratic challenger Brandon Presley. So, of course, in today's video, we're going to talk about the Mississippi governor's race. We're going to take a look at some of the polls, as well as some previous Mississippi elections to sort of determine where this race could possibly end up on Tuesday. And, of course, a final prediction for this race, as well as races in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky will be released tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. But in today's video, we're going to focus on the governor's race and analyze the chances of a Democratic upset here. But of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So Tate Reeves is not very popular. There's two main reasons for that. The first one is the Jackson water crisis, which he's been criticized by many Mississippi voters as handling very poorly. That city has been dealing with very contaminated drinking water for some time now, and there really hasn't been much movement in the direction of fixing that. And then, of course, you have the welfare corruption scandal, which really occurred before Tate Reeves took office, but again, voters sort of blame him for the way he responded to that. And of course, those put together is a pretty lethal combination for an incumbent. He's also not very popular. Of course, the saving grace for Tate Reeves is the fact that Mississippi is a Republican state, is a very conservative state. Brandon Presley, on the other hand, is the current Public Service Commissioner of northern Mississippi. He formerly served as the mayor of Nettleton, which is a small town in northern Mississippi, and he's pretty popular among Mississippi voters, at least in his area of the state. If we go back to 2015, he was able to win this region of northern Mississippi by 21 percentage points. This area of the state probably voted for Donald Trump by 30 points. If we go back to 2016, if you just take a look at some of the counties here, back in 2016, this area was strongly Republican. Lee County, for instance, the most populous county in northern Mississippi, went to Donald Trump by 37 points. Brandon Presley was able to get over 60% of the vote here. And in the suburbs around Tupelo, which are actually redder than the surrounding city itself, Brandon Presley was able to do even better. So this goes to show you that he does have a decently strong base with conservative rural voters, and it's evident by his past electoral history. And then, of course, in 2019, Brandon Presley was so well liked by the people in northern Mississippi that the Republicans didn't even run an opponent against him. So that just goes to show you the sort of formidable candidate he is. Now, again, as I mentioned, Mississippi is a very Republican state when it comes to presidential and federal races, and a Republican hasn't won the governorship here since 1999. So it's certainly an uphill battle, but the last race for governor in Mississippi was fairly close. Tate Reeves was going up against incumbent Attorney General Jim Hood. Tate Reeves was also not exactly popular when he was running for office either. And then, of course, you had Jim Hood massively overperform where Democrats typically are in the state of Mississippi. He only lost this race by 5.5 points, and he was able to make massive inroads in traditionally very Republican counties, not just in the rural parts of the state, but even urban areas. Lee County, he only lost by 18 points. Hattiesburg, he only lost by around 2 points. Biloxi only lost by 18, and I say only because if we take a look at the 2016 results, Hillary Clinton lost Lee County by 37 points, Hattiesburg by 14, and Biloxi by 30. So that just goes to show you that there were massive swings in the direction of the Democrats in 2019. Even in very rural areas, Lafayette County, for instance, going to Jim Hood by 6 points. This was a county that voted for Donald Trump by 15 points. So swings in urban and rural counties, it still wasn't enough. You know, Mississippi is very, very tough territory for Democrats demographically. The state has one of the largest black populations per capita in the country, but white voters in the state of Mississippi are hyper-Republican. They tend to vote for the party 80-20. So with those sort of numbers, it's impossible to win statewide as a Democrat. Jim Hood obviously chipped away at those numbers and did significantly better, but it really takes high black turnout in western Mississippi and chipping away significantly, very significantly, at Republicans' margins in the rest of the state and in urban centers. So it really is a very tough climb for a Democrat to win here statewide. Again, the last time a Democrat won in Mississippi was in 1999. So throughout the 21st century, Mississippi has only elected Republican governors. And, you know, that's, of course, a testament to how red the state has gotten in the recent decades. Now, Brandon Presley is not running as your typical Democrat. He's pro-life, he's pro-gun. He's a much more socially moderate Democrat, and in some ways he would be considered very socially conservative by nationwide standards. So, socially, he's more or less akin to a Republican, although there's a couple issues where I think he would be a bit more centrist than your typical Republican. But by and large, it's something that makes him palatable to the majority of voters in Mississippi, because had Brandon Presley run as a progressive Democrat, he would probably lose the state by around 20-25 points, and we really wouldn't be talking about it. So the fact that Brandon Presley is running as a more conservative Democrat is really what makes this race very competitive. Now, if we go down to the polling for this election, Tate Reeves is currently up in the average by 9.5 points. Now, I think the polls are a bit unreliable here because most of the polls are very partisan polls. They're either Democratic internals that have this race essentially tied, or you have Republican polls that have Tate Reeves up by, in some cases, even double digits. And you've got some local newspaper polls, Mississippi Today, Siena College. Siena College is not really a reliable pollster. So by and large, you meld all these different polls together and you get an average of Reeves up by 9.5 points. Now, that very well could be the margin he wins on Tuesday. Many speculate this race is going to be closer just because Tate Reeves is so unpopular. And Brandon Presley is very well known and liked in the state of Mississippi. Again, he was able to win in a heavily conservative Republican district many times and reelected to the point where he didn't even have an opponent back in 2019. So, going back 2011, for instance, again, pretty impressive margins in an area of the state that tends to vote very Republican. Now, Tate Reeves, again, as evidenced by his 2019 performance, not exactly popular. He's still not popular today. It really is just the fact that Mississippi is such a Republican state and really just an inelastic state that gives him a pretty decent shot at winning here. Now, Mississippi is pretty used to electing unpopular Republicans, not just Tate Reeves back in 2019, but if we go back to the 2018 elections, you had Republican Cindy Hyde-Smith going up against Democrat Mike Espy. And, this race was pretty close. Now, no candidate got to 50% on the first ballot. Of course, then it went to a runoff. Cindy Hyde-Smith ends up winning this race by around 8 points. But 8 points is pretty close by Mississippi standards, especially considering the fact that Donald Trump won the state by 17 points just 2 years earlier and 16 points 2 years later. So Mississippi is relatively inelastic when we're talking about presidential and statewide races, but, this was sort of the exception. Cindy Hyde-Smith was a fairly unpopular, scandal-ridden candidate. Mike Espy was a pretty charismatic candidate who was able to energize black voters in the western portion of the state and, of course, chip away at Cindy Hyde-Smith's margins in rural Mississippi, but, of course, it still wasn't enough. So that just goes to show you that even though Republicans can be very unpopular in Mississippi, they still end up winning because most voters here that vote Republican in the presidential races will vote Republican down ballot and in statewide races. So the electorate is much more inelastic in Mississippi than it is in Kentucky, for instance. Kentucky was a state that voted for Donald Trump by 25 points, I believe, back in 2020. And yet just a year earlier, they elected a Democratic governor. And at this rate, they're going to reelect that Democratic governor in a couple of days. So it goes to show you that, this state, even though it is closer than Kentucky, it's much less elastic. And, you'll tend to see that with states in the South versus states in Appalachia and to a lesser extent states like Montana, which tend to be very red when it comes to the federal politics, but then statewide they tend to be much bluer. So I want to take a look a second back at 2019, because if we take a look at the polls for the 2019 governor's race, the polls were actually a lot closer than the result actually was. If we take a look at the polls, we don't have an aggregate here, but Jim Hood was leading in a number of polls. Now, a lot of these were Democratic internals, but it does go to show you that by and large, he was much more competitive in the polling than he actually ended up being on election day. And, hypothetical polls between other candidates. And at the end of the day, he still ended up losing by around 5.5 points. Brandon Presley is not polling as well. But again, I've argued that these polls don't really seem to be that reliable, but I don't doubt that Tate Reeves is ahead. And I think at the end of the day, at this rate, he's probably going to win re-election. I certainly would consider Brandon Presley winning on Tuesday night very much an upset. So very difficult for Democrats to win here in the state of Mississippi. We're going to be releasing our final prediction for the Mississippi governor's race, as well as Kentucky, the Virginia legislative races, Pennsylvania, in tomorrow's video. So stay tuned for that. And of course, link down below to the election night live stream, 7:30 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday. Hope you can join us there. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.